The night took a turn that no one anticipated. Fans saw a furious altercation instead of Kirk Frost and Lil Scrappy sharing the same platform in jubilation. Conversation that soon became the topic of conversation within the love and hip-hop community. Words that stung deeper than anybody expected apparently transformed what began as light-hearted conversation into something worse. According to witnesses, tensions had been building for weeks, and everything eventually came to a head at this point. His irate voice echoed around the room as he questioned respect and devotion. Kirk, who never backs down, matched his enthusiasm, verbatim. People in the vicinity reported that the tension in the air was so heavy that they could practically feel it crushing on their chests as emotions ran high. All right. The features of all those in attendance were etched with horror. However, the moment that truly astounded fans was when Momma Dee, who is often vocal, and she was never afraid to stand up for her kid, her response fueled the fire that was already burning fiercely. There was more to the altercation than just two individuals insulting each other. It spoke to something more profound, something unprocessed and unfinished. The whole LHH community is now humming, wondering what caused this dispute to reach a breaking point. Silence had weighed down the night. The city's murmurs would not stop. The same narrative that had captured everyone's attention was buzzing around dimly lit living rooms, street sides, and little nooks of pubs. It was no longer only a rumor. Now, Tood's unexpected death was a fact that no one could comprehend. He was not only a rapper, he represented unadulterated, unrefined vitality. A man who exposed his suffering for everyone to witness via his songs. Many people didn't believe the news when it initially broke that he had died. Others believed it to be just another PR gimmick, a nasty joke that the internet likes to pull on its celebrities. However, the reality descended like a thick storm cloud that would not go away as the hours stretched into days. As video emerged and the voices closest to him started to break under the strain of sorrow, those who were familiar with him could not contain their feelings. He was the type of person who could make a room full of strangers feel like home, according to one buddy. He was portrayed by some as a tormented individual who was fighting demons that only became louder as he gained popularity. Contradictions surrounding his persona made him even more alluring. But the power was undeniable, regardless of how others perceived him. On stage, he carried. He lacked polish. He wasn't ideal. He was genuine, though. Additionally, in a field where genuineness has long, he stood as a unique voice that felt always real when questioned. His death circumstances just became worse. The enigma. There were conflicting reports. Some claimed it was a terrible turn of events, an accident. Some muttered more sinister tales that alluded to treachery at unseen hands tugging strings in the background. As the conjecture increased, so did the hostility between his supporters and the field that had previously hailed him. Why was the response unclear? Why did people closest to him continue to communicate in carefully chosen phrases and in half-sentences? Every piece of information made public seems to lead to something new, one that leads to a tangle of questions, from which there is no escape. People felt farther away from the reality the more they attempted to comprehend. His family was weeping and in the limelight, which they had not requested throughout this storm. Vigil cameras flashed, microphones were thrust into their faces, and they were asked questions when they just wanted to be silent. During one meeting, a distraught mother sobbed, stating that her son shouldn't have left so quickly. Even people who had never met him directly felt the reverberation of her suffering. Thud's relationship with his family had always been complex, with many highs and lows. However, currently every unsolved dispute was stuck in the past. The world was seeing every tear, every gesture, and every remark they spoke because the loss had created a wound that would not heal. Said. The industry, however, battled its own guilt. Producers began making public declarations about their belief in his ability, their chats with him, and their intended ambitions. However, many followers noticed that behind these remarks, dishonesty. When he most needed these voices, where were they? When he was, where were they? Weeping through his songs, pleading for assistance in ways that few saw, social media turned into a blame game as a result of the hurtful hypocrisy. Some said that the industry took advantage of him until he was completely depleted. Others supported it, saying that individual decisions were more important. But there was one thing that everyone agreed upon, regardless of who was at fault. His passing created a void that was unable to be filled. The theories expanded along with the tale. Online users started to gather bits and pieces of his final days, movies, live broadcasts, and intimate chats that all of a sudden took on new significance. One of his last articles was a sentence regarding the fact that his followers were surrounded by individuals who didn't genuinely care made them shiver. Was that a clue? Was that an admission that he was under pressure? The ambiguity pushed supporters farther into their quest for clarification. Every bit of information was examined, forums were crowded with conversations, and threads went on forever. People clung to rumors in their anguish, hoping they might bring him back, or at least make feeling of the mayhem that was left behind. One name kept coming up in the midst of the confusion. After sharing stages with him, a buddy-turned-opponent ended up in a sour rivalry. Although the specifics of their fallout were never made public, many people assumed it had something to do with loyalty and financial treachery. Rumor had it that no one knew more about the days before his death than this individual. That camp's deafening silence and the absence of a statement only served to heighten suspicion. The industry sought control over the story. The family wanted peace, and the fans wanted answers. However, neither party was prepared to provide what the other requested. The strain was intolerable. The most disturbing information, however, came from people who were present during his last hours, despite all the conjecture. They characterized him as agitated, pacing, and speaking in disconnected snatches, as if his mind were struggling with many realities at once. In his epiphanies, he talked about his intentions for new songs and how he was prepared to start anew and take things more seriously. However, his voice would take a break. He would get quiet, and his hands would shake. One individual said that he appeared to be a man bearing a burden that nobody else could perceive. A burden too great for one individual to handle. Those pictures of him persisted in the thoughts of people who were concerned, depicting a person who has been smothered by pressures too great to overcome on their own, rather than a rapper who passed away too soon. His hometown was the one that was most affected by his passing. Almost immediately, murals started to sprout, on walls and bridges, encapsulating his likeness with phrases like "forever" and "never forgotten." When he used to go around neighborhoods, his music would blast out of vehicle windows. His voice seemed to be unable to be silenced by the streets. Fans told him how his music had helped them go through their worst moments, lit candles, and left flowers. He wasn't only to them an artist. He served as a buddy during times of loneliness, a support system during difficult times, and a reminder that suffering might be transformed into strength. The group's collective sorrow developed into a campaign that demanded that his name not be forgotten or dismissed as just another statistic. But while the story was in grief, shadows started to appear. Threats and subliminal cues to be quiet began to be sent to those close to him. The doors were abruptly shut on journalists who were delving too deeply into the circumstances surrounding his demise. Some sources who had previously spoken freely now backed off. Interviews were canceled, and film inexplicably disappeared. Someone seems to want the narrative to continue to be unfinished in order to conceal the reality under layers of misunderstanding. No response could overpower this quiet, generating suspicion that the disaster was the result of something more significant and hazardous. The query about everyone's lips were simple, but they couldn't be answered. Who was truly aware of Toot's fate? And why didn't they say anything? The world waited anxiously, caught between sadness and rage, and in need of an explanation that never seemed to come, to follow. And as the days stretched into weeks, the sense that something important was being withheld only intensified, drawing everyone farther into an unending tale. For what seemed like hours, the room was silent, despite the fact that just after a few moments, everyone's attention was on the quivering figure at the corner. Someone who was obviously carrying greater burdens than anybody else was aware of. Nobody dared to ask the questions that hung in the air. Emotions, however, were simmering under the surface, just waiting for one spark to ignite the whole thing. It went beyond what had been previously said, and instead focused on the fissures that may have been developing for months or even years. Now it was hard to ignore the cracks. When the first words did come, they were quieter than anticipated and nearly overpowered by the anxious hearts beating. However, the reality they brought struck more forcefully than any cry. The confession was harsh, honest, and unvarnished. Another layer of the facade is pulled back with each phrase, things everyone had spent so much time clinging to. Not only was the reality unsettling, but it was also harmful. It posed a danger to destroy relationships, set family members against one another, and reveal secrets that some would do something that should remain buried. In a frenzied flood of incredulity, rage, and despair, the responses came, swiftly and overlapped. While one person slapped their fist on the table and demanded answers, another person attempted to defuse the situation, but their voice cracked from the strain of maintaining order. The space was no longer unified to become an emotional battleground. With every second, the stress increased. Accusations flying, voices increasing, each action growing more aggressive and pointed. Everyone knew in their hearts that things could never be the same again. There had been too much revealed and too much said. One individual stood strangely silent in the midst of it all, looking at every face in the room. At least not in a visible way, they weren't responding like the others. Rather, a chilly calculation was in the background. They're quiet, as if they were formulating a strategy in real time, waiting for the ideal opportunity to use words that were more powerful than a knife. The impact was immediate when they finally talked. There was a startled silence in the room, as if everyone had known intuitively that whatever happened next would tip the scales. The words were measured, purposeful, and loaded with meaning. Something anyone could overlook. It was more than simply self-defense. It was about pointing out other people's flaws. Like daggers, subtle reminders of past errors were dropped with precision to reignite old wounds. It was a brutal yet successful tactic. Those who had been the most outspoken started to fail one by one, their confidence eroding as the consequences of their previous mistakes came back to haunt them. Those who had been erect now found themselves defensive, their ideas disintegrating, their voices growing weaker. Not everyone, however, was prepared to be quieted. All eyes jerked to the source as a sharp shout sliced through the atmosphere, like thunder. There was no denying their wrath, but behind it was a fragility that turned the explosion into a plea for assistance rather than an assault. They had grown weary of bearing the weight by themselves and of feigning strength while crumbling in silence. They described treachery, unacknowledged sacrifices, and unrequited love that was never fully reciprocated. Every line was accompanied with honesty so unvarnished that it hurt even the most conflict-hardened people. However, the vulnerability stoked further division rather than fostering softer hearts. Some nodded in sympathy, as if they were now hearing the truth they had been too scared to express. Others became defensive, refusing to take responsibility or own their role in the escalating maelstrom. What had begun as a furious dispute descended into anarchy once more as the gap widened. Voices clashed, anger blended with tears. And the danger of total collapse hung over them like a gloomy shadow in the middle of everything. Rumors were already circulating outside the room. There was no hiding what was going on within. The truth was leaking out in bits and pieces, carried by people who couldn't handle the shock of what they had just heard. Rumors spread quickly, gaining traction with each recounting. The world outside was already buzzing with rumors by the time the debate within reached its climax. Every rumor gets more inflated than the previous. What was once a private dispute would soon blow up into a public scandal that would be hard to stop and hard to ignore. Exhaustion set in once they were back inside. Voices broke, the yelling weakened, and the force that had first driven the storm started to diminish. People fell back in their seats, stillness taking the place of their rage. As if the reality had grown too weighty to face head-on, their gazes avoided one another. Despite being oppressive and full with unsaid words, the silence wasn't calm. Knowledge that there was still nothing to resolve. The situation was much worse than it had been. There was no longer any trust. Connections had been tainted, and every effort to proceed seemed pointless. Then a voice that nobody has heard before appeared, gently but steadily, piercing the silence. It wasn't the voice of authority or the person who had previously controlled the debate. Rather, it belonged to someone who had waited, watched, and listened largely in the background up until this point. Their comments were infused with something other than cold strategy or accusations, and call for integrity, responsibility, and the opportunity to pull back from the edge before it was too late. It wasn't a request. Neither a request for allegiance nor for pardon. It was difficult to confront the reality head-on without hiding, bending, or fleeing. It was an unexpected impact. As they realized the extent of the grief that had been disregarded for too long, several people listened with tears in their eyes. Others squirmed uneasily, unwilling to completely reject the demand for vulnerability but unable to resist it either. Once more, the room stood on the verge of disintegration and reconciliation, with no obvious path forward. Ahead. It was a long time before anyone talked again, but this time the stillness seemed different. It wasn't the quiet of avoidance or terror. It was the quiet that came with facing reality and understanding that something needed to change, even if none was aware of how. A dot. The door creaked open under the weight of that moment, and the room shook at the sight of someone who had been nowhere to be seen during the pandemonium. Their sheer presence held power, influence, and the capacity to change all that had been spoken. Thus their appearance completely changed the environment. Hearts pounded, breathing caught, and eyes grew wide. As if everyone had an innate sense that the narrative was far from over, that the actual repercussions were just starting to show. The panic caused by the news only increased with each hour, as it spread like wildfire. On the internet, people were debating and speculating. Those involved in the matter were scurrying silently behind the scenes. It was no longer only a scandal. It was developing into a serious situation that would permanently damage relationships and reputations. Trust became even more scarce as rumors began to circulate about who knew what and when. Suddenly, every look, every pause, and every silence looked suspect. Those who used to stand strongly together were now questioning one another's allegiance. Accusations were thrown about the room, and tempers erupted behind closed doors. There was simply a sense of betrayal that was so strong that anyone who ventured to speak would be choked. There was neither peace nor understanding. Once aligned, individuals appeared to be adversaries compelled to coexist. In fits of wrath, secrets that ought to have been kept were revealed, and words that ought to have been metered came out harsh. Everyone wanted to blame, but no one wanted to accept responsibility. The media created their own image beyond the circle. They put disparate pieces of information together and twisted them into stories that made their headlines. Got full-blown after that. Rumors and tales were passed off as reality. What was genuine no longer mattered. What was important was what could draw the greatest interest. The craze was fueled by fans who devoured everything, while those in its center lacked authority over their own narrative, and the strain grew, intolerable as new rumors surfaced every day. An additional level of ambiguity. Doubt started to cause relationships to fall apart. Arguments became quiet, and conversations became arguments. The participants were caught in a never-ending loop of interrogating others and defending themselves. What had formerly been moments of trust and fun now carried skepticism and